This is a great crowd, and I'm thrilled to see you here. Welcome, and thank you for coming to the third of our 4 Voices from the Vanguard lecture series. My name is Pat Thomas. I'm the Knight Chair in Health and Medical Journalism at Grady College. These lectures are a collaboration between my program and the UGA Center for Tropical and Emerging Global Diseases, headed by Dan Colley. And we are also very grateful for the financial support from the President's Venture Fund. Now, Dan really wanted to be here, but he's in Kenya with some snails right now. He studies schistosomiasis. If you've been here before, you know that the speakers in this lecture series are not just researchers and thinkers, but people who are taking real actions that will save millions of lives around the world. Tonight, you'll hear from Dr. Don Francis, one of the most important figures in the 25-year history of HIV/AIDS. He'll talk for 40 or 45 minutes or so, then take questions, and after that, we invite you to join us next door in Demosthenian Hall for a reception. At the first International AIDS meeting back in April 1985 in Atlanta, Don Francis was one of the most controversial speakers on the program. I remember because I was there. He had alienated many of his colleagues at CDC and in the government by insisting that scientists already knew enough about this dangerous new virus called HTLV3 at the time to make specific public health recommendations. At that time, Dr. Francis was on the warpath about screening donated blood to make sure people wouldn't be infected by transfusions. He was also urging gay men, who were the epicenter of the epidemic at that point, to be tested with a newly available antibody test and to have sex only with people whose antibody status matched their own. More cautious government authorities thought these recommendations were premature, even rash, and that Dr. Francis was out of line to suggest such things. So it came as no surprise soon after the meeting when I heard that he had been transferred to San Francisco, where he would be an advisor to public health officials there. But he stayed true to form, and he pretty much angered the gay community in that city by insisting that the popular bathhouses be shut down. In his words, they were nothing more than amplification systems for this virus. Now, chronicling all of this was a man who was in the press rooms with me and other people at that time, Randy Schultz, the San Francisco Chronicle's only openly gay reporter. Probably not its only gay reporter, but openly gay was pretty rare at that time. So in 1987, Randy published his seminal book, And the Band Played On. This is still the most influential book ever written about HIV/AIDS. And the hero of that story, as many of you know if you've ever read the book or seen the movie, was Don Francis. Now, Francis left CDC in 1992 and went to a large biotech company south of San Francisco called Genentech. And there he became the clinical leader of the company's pioneering efforts to develop and test a vaccine to prevent HIV infection. The company abandoned this effort, however, in mid-1994 after the federal government pulled back from an earlier commitment to test this vaccine and another one in trials large enough to show whether they really worked or didn't work. Now, companies were leaving this field. There was a lot of depression about the prospects for an HIV vaccine. But Don Francis was not a person to ever take no for an answer. So he teamed up with some of the scientists who had invented this vaccine, and he started a company called VaxGen, a spinoff determined to organize and carry out a clinical trial that would answer the question, do we have a vaccine to prevent AIDS or don't we? In January 1997, I began researching a book about the quest for an AIDS vaccine. And within the first 2 months, I lived in Boston at the time, I'd interviewed about 30 people on the East Coast. Now, nearly every one of those people wanted to talk to me about Don Francis's crazy idea of starting VaxGen. And people told me that he was delusional, living in a dream world, if he thought that he could raise the $18 million that Genentech wanted up front in order to free up their patent protections on the vaccine. Now, in March, I headed west to do some interviews on the West Coast, and in Seattle, I think the first people that I talked to there said, you know what? Don Francis and his partners have raised that money. Well, I thought, this probably can't be true. Anyway, I interviewed Don on March 26, 1997, on a rainy day when I had horrible laryngitis, and he was on a lunch break from an advisory board meeting to the UC Regents, I believe it was. And I was stunned when we sat down to talk, and he told me, no, we didn't just raise $18 million, we raised $27 million to launch this trial, and we did it by talking to small groups of rich people in little conference rooms, in Four Seasons, and Ritz-Carltons, and a Holiday Inn somewhere in South Florida. Now, I came away thinking that no one should ever count this guy out, ever. The VaxGen trial began in June 1998 in the United States and Thailand, and on February 24, 2003, its final results were announced. And disappointingly, the vaccine showed no overall ability to protect healthy people against infection. But Don Francis was not finished. Tonight, he'll continue the story, picking up where I left off, I think, with a talk entitled Deadly Imbalance, Social versus Medical Value of Preventive Vaccines. And here's Don Francis.
Thank you, Pat, very much. Does this get everyone here? What I thought I would do more than HIV vaccines was to broaden this story about vaccines in general and really highlight the confusion that we have as societies in general, and that confusion being broader in who actually speaks for the society at large, both the U.S. society, but equally important, the world society, in terms of adding the social value, if you will, to vaccines in general for not only the United States, but the world as a whole, since these are incredibly valuable tools. And it's a bit of a sad story, to be honest, HIV vaccine being only a small piece of it, how with absence of the social value, one has real trouble in stimulating the private sector that makes vaccines to actually make them and see the progress that we've seen over the years for infectious disease control. So with that, let me start. And there's really 2 points I want to make about vaccines. Vaccines, as you know, you give to an individual before they're infected to prevent the disease occurrence in someone, in yourself later after your immune system has recognized the pseudo-infection that the vaccine gives you. Hopefully without disease you get immunity, and therefore your body thinks it's been exposed to the disease and you don't get it in the future in your life. So the clear public health goal of a vaccine is to decrease or eliminate the disease in question to which the vaccine is targeted. And realize everyone in this room has received probably close to a dozen vaccines in your childhood, and we don't see multiple diseases because of that. But what I want to add here, and this is the important theme of this talk, is not only decrease or eliminate disease, but in the shortest possible time. That is, we should be able to apply our scientific technology to make the vaccine in the shortest time possible, and then ultimately apply the vaccine to eliminate the disease. And here is where, on both of these, how we break down, to be honest. So what I want to do is talk about this example of the delay that has occurred in looking at past vaccines, and try to explore why we see this delay in both from the time of discovery of the organism to making the vaccine, then importantly, from the time the vaccine is made to the time the disease is eliminated. And that why really, in my mind, I'll use the term lack of social value. That is, we do not give value to vaccines. Even though we don't suffer from these diseases, we don't look ahead in the future to give the social value which will stimulate the production of new vaccines in the future. And in that, I will look extensively at the roles of both private sector, which traditionally has made vaccines, and the social value there is a return on investment, and the public health people who generally make the recommendations and deliver those vaccines, and how we end up with a lack of coordination, if you will, a lack of social value, if you will, given by public health to vaccine development that inhibits industry from making it. And then, because of this lack of value given to it, I want to talk about why industry would make these decisions and deal with the cost of vaccine development, how much it costs to make any drug now, and ultimately then, if you're going to invest in it, this is what you have to invest, and then deal with the cost on the other side of the risk-benefit, that is, what it costs you by delaying the development and ultimately the delivery of the vaccine. And this is all kind of a downer, and I admit it. This is not a good example of our social, our society, as I think recently we've had many measurements of the lack of our social wisdom, but this is just one of them. But I'm going to put in here at the end a positive note, how especially with the money coming from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, how there are changes, especially in the less developed parts of the world, that have stimulated a change. So I don't want to send you all out with frowns and gray faces. We just say we have some real holes in our society, and hopefully we're fixing those holes, much like the holes in a road. Now let's look at this. This is the occurrence of multiple diseases in the United States. This is diphtheria, we have measles, polio, and ultimately you see AIDS coming up, which carries on ad infinitum at this point. And I want to really stress the left-hand side of this slide, which is this remarkable decline in diseases that my parents, your grandparents had as routine. I think in my mother's aunts, at least of her family, all but one of them got diphtheria and about half of them died. So it was incredibly common that everyone in the United States got these diseases, and the reason they declined primarily were vaccines, and so they've had a tremendous effect. So that's the good news. And I want to take some examples of these diseases and show how the good news is good, that is, that we eliminated the disease. The sad thing is that once we had the tools to eliminate the disease, we didn't do it as fast as we could. And the first one I want to deal with is smallpox, which is a disease none of you have seen, but of one of which I have either had the fortune or misfortune of dealing a great deal with in my earlier days at CDC, which really infected everyone in the world. Don Hopkins at CDC wrote a book called Princes and Paupers or something like that, where he outlined the effect of smallpox on especially the elite royalty of various countries. Smallpox, it really killed, it infected everyone, and about 40–50% of people died. So you can imagine what that did to princes and paupers around the world. And so everyone had scars on their face from smallpox, and somewhere around 40% had died in any given family, including the elite of all countries with princes and all people with paupers, and had a huge effect on the history of the world as kings and princes and such died. And interestingly, Edward Jenner, who I think is on the next slide, made the observation that the only pretty faces in UK at the time were milkmaids. They were the only ones whose face did not look like it had received a shotgun blast and had all these pocks all over it, these holes. But they had pox on their hands, and he surmised that the teats of cows had these lesions also, and that they remembered getting these raised lesions on their hand that produced a hole in their hand, but they never then got smallpox on their face. And so he surmised that if you took the pus from one of these cows and giving that to people may protect smallpox. And this is actually the picture, rendition of the picture where he took a child and actually vaccinated him with the cowpox virus to get, and then exposed this child to smallpox, and the child did not come down with it. So this was one of the earliest vaccines ever initiated, and it actually ended up being the tool that we ultimately use for the eradication of smallpox around the world. And this is looking at the number of countries with smallpox from 1967 to 1977. And you can see that there was a concerted effort of the world to actually end smallpox in their own countries. And then this was actually the beginning of the WHO program that then began vaccinating kids all around the world. And what we did then was search for cases in different parts of the world and then vaccinate extensively around them. And so that was good news. We ultimately eliminated smallpox in the world, and no one actually is using the smallpox vaccine anymore because the only host for smallpox are humans, which is wonderful. If you stop it in humans, it doesn't come out of an animal species. And so we were able to stop the use of the smallpox vaccine because of some of the toxicities associated with it, and that there was no disease. So the good news is that we eliminated smallpox. Whoa, now I'm stuck, and they're gone. Because it will not go backwards, I'm told. But the good news was, that I'll show you on a subsequent slide, was that we eliminated smallpox. The problem was this was a delay of literally decades, if not centuries, from the discovery of the vaccine and the proof that it actually would prevent disease until the actually eliminating disease in the late 70s. So there was a huge delay that occurred, and therefore literally millions and millions of people around the world died needlessly. And so there was this god-awful delay that occurred, and I went off to Africa and India for the better part of, 3 years chasing smallpox, and it's a horrible disease. It's still killing about 40% and scarring and really decimating families. But it was, oh, look at that, thank you. That it was a huge time delay that since I can't go backwards, I'll show you on a subsequent slide. So there was good news and bad news on smallpox, also good news and bad news on polio. Polio, a disease that when I was a child, there was no polio vaccine. And this is a picture of Rancho Los Amigos in Southern California of the iron lungs, the most severe part of polio. It would affect the lower limbs, then go all the way up and ultimately get your respiratory nerves and then the respiratory paralysis. And so these were the earliest of respirators. These people cannot breathe because polio has paralyzed their respiratory nerves, and therefore a vacuum process, just like a respirator with a tube, has to be instilled. And so there were literally just rooms and rooms. And I remember there was one hospital in San Francisco that I would drive by as a kid, and you'd see through the glass in the windows all these people on these respirators. And then I did my pediatric training at LA County Hospital, and we had all of these stored in the back and occasionally used them for Guillain-Barré and the like. So this was a horrible disease. And interestingly, in contrast to HIV, that there was a great political pull and push to do something about polio. And unfortunately, the President of the United States, at the age of 39, well before he was elected, was paralyzed with polio and was in a wheelchair throughout his presidency, although I think this is one of the few pictures of him in the wheelchair. You'll always see him standing against something or with someone, and he would never show in public that he was totally paralyzed and in a wheelchair or crutches. But this was Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and then he started from Warm Springs, Georgia, the March of Dimes equivalent. It was called the Infantile Paralysis Program at the time, where you'd go to Warm Springs and elsewhere to get therapy for your polio and also raise money for vaccine development. It helps to be President of the United States when it comes to developing programs for any disease, and to be afflicted with the disease or personally affected with it. Unfortunately, we haven't seen you can see, unfortunately, for several things, we haven't seen that with the current administrations, either the commitment or the affliction. I don't know which one you would wish for. This is, I just got back from India a while ago and going back again in a couple of weeks. This is polio continuing in India. This young man was at a house where the child had polio, but there's a massive immunization program going on in the world right now to try to eliminate polio. And how do we do that? This is Jonas Salk, as a young man who had the clever idea of just growing up a bunch of polio virus and killing it with chemicals and using that as the vaccine for polio. And you see here I'll probably have to read some of this, but this is the this is 1985 and now 2009. This was the progress towards polio eradication that now, remember in that last slide, Jonas Salk discovered the vaccine in 1955. This is 1985. In 1988, the World Health Assembly makes a resolution to eradicate polio in the world. 1999, this has not been easy, continued to do that. This was the original target date for eradication. We still have a few countries now with polio. Unfortunately, we've had a big setback with the Muslim countries in North Africa, especially in Nigeria, where they thought this was some family planning program the like and stopped immunizing. And so then Hajj followers marching across North Africa to Mecca spread the disease all the way to Mecca and then beyond all the way to Indonesia. So we had to clean that back up. And India continues, a little bit in Afghanistan, but hopefully we'll be able to eradicate polio in the next few years. This is the issue of India. This is the cases of India. And you see these massive amounts, and then the program begins. These are the mass immunization days all across India, which is a huge effort, as you might imagine. And we still have these few leftover cases, about 16 in UP and 16 in Bihar last year. So they continue to dribble on, and it's a little tougher than smallpox, because you have to literally immunize every kid. But let's look, here's now the slide that if I don't punch the button again, this is smallpox here. The vaccine became, quote, commercially available sometime after the 1900s. It was eradicated in Northern Europe and the United States between 1930 and 1953, with a delay of 30 to 50 years between the vaccine to eradication. That the worldwide eradication occurred in 1977, and so you end up with half a century or 3/4 of a century from the time the vaccine was available to the time that it was eradicated around the world. And you saw that slide just back there with all the polio cases from India. You can imagine what decades of polio do to little kids that you saw walking on a stick in the previous slide. You have literally, you just drive along the streets in northern India and you see case after case of polio that really is tough enough to be a child or a young adult in India, but you can imagine being one with either one leg or no legs functioning at all. And here's polio with the vaccine in 55, a 36 years delay to eradicating in North America and Europe, and it looks, if we're lucky, to be able to eradicate it in 50 years in the rest of the world. Now let's take the last disease. This is hepatitis B virus infection. Hepatitis B is another virus spread by sex or blood sharing, much like HIV, that produces some pretty terrible diseases. Here, this is just the outline of it, with 60 to 90 days from the time you get infected to the time you turn yellow, and you get jaundice, infrequently as a child, and maybe a third or so of the individuals actually turn yellow, and you can tell. So it's a relatively mild disease with very little mortality when it comes to the acute case of hepatitis that all of you would be fearful of. But this is the real challenge, that the chronic infection that occurs literally years after that people become carriers of the virus and then develop cirrhosis or cancer of the liver somewhere in the neighborhood of 30, 40 years after infection. And that is a huge mortality. When you talk about 15 to 25% of the individuals are going to die of their chronic disease. Here's really what I would call the modern disease like HIV that has a long incubation period from the time of the infection to the time of the actual manifestation of disease and death. Well, let's look at this. Here's, again, a wonderful vaccine. This is the first recombinant vaccine where we didn't have to grow up virus, but it was done by a private sector company, Merck, who figured out a way to inactivate the virus. Vaccine, this is cases in the United States, 78 to 95. It was licensed here. We finally started screening of pregnant women and vaccination of babies here, and then infant immunization now in 1991. This is 10 years in the United States, 10 years from the discovery of the vaccine to it was actually recommended, and then adolescent catch-up immunization another 3 years after that. So a remarkable time from a very effective vaccine that literally can eliminate hepatitis B virus infection with little problem, and yet this huge delay from the time that it was licensed to the time it was used. And that's in the United States of America. This is the rest of the world with the, I'm dead. That was the rest of the world with, oh, thank you, with the, I've got two buttons here and I can't, you know, all these years of education, I can't figure out which button to push in order to go forward or backwards, so I apologize. But, oh, I did it even twice. Go back another one. Gee whiz, no, keep going back. I must have had about 20. There we go. Now I'll try to be better, thank you. And the places in maximum need of hepatitis B infection, where 60–70% of the population infected with hepatitis B virus, is Central Africa, and this means that no vaccine program exists there at all. So it took us years to even apply it in a country like the United States, and now, what, 30 years almost after the invention of the vaccine, it is still not used in the parts of the world where it is needed the most. So why do we have these delays? Why do you have major disease occurrence causing horrible situations and tools necessary to develop them, or indeed an interest, a virus that we know causes it and we could make a vaccine, but we haven't even made the vaccine yet? And I think it's relatively straightforward now that I've been in the government and the private sector, both making and using these kinds of products. I think I can give some sort of a crude overall view that you find the virus, you need to figure out what part of the virus the immune system is directed towards, make candidate vaccines, use them in animals and see if they work, and then once you've developed the vaccine in humans, actually apply that vaccine. Simple, no? You figure out what the virus is, figure out what the immune response is, figure out how to make a vaccine safely, try it in animals and then humans, and then public health takes it and gives it to the people and the disease goes away. Really remarkably straightforward. This is not complex politics in reality. This is simple science. And it's all driven by social value. That is, what the people in this room think is important will be done because people will ultimately drive this through either political pressure or funding or something else. So that's the process, and I say social value is the key here to drive it. Let's now start from that and work our way down. Who makes vaccines? Where's the expertise starting down this pathway that actually will develop it? And it really is in two places. One is places like this. The discovery of the agent, the figuring out what the immune response is, what the immunology is, what would be the logical vaccine. And then the private pharmaceutical companies take that on in really the development path. Now, it's important for you folks in university to realize that universities, by and large, do not make these products. Many times the government thinks if they dump more money through NIH, it will come to universities and universities will make vaccines. But I think there's an important split here between university academic research and actual product development. This is a wonderful report by McKinsey & Company that the World Bank made. And let me read this because I think this is really worthwhile. The public sector institutions involved in vaccine R&D are primarily focused on basic science knowledge diffusion rather than single-mindedly solving applied development problems to ensure large-scale consistent production. That's an important sentence, complex, but universities are discovery pieces, and they do research and discover, whereas industry is really, some will complain that it's so highly focused, but now that I've been in industry, it's wonderful. This is a product, you move it along and see if it works, and if it works, make lots of it, sell it, and make money. The incentives in the public sector reinforce this knowledge focus and are generally inconsistent with efficient production of commodities. Let me put that into very simple terms. If you're in a university, your output is knowledge. The measurement of that output really are the manuscripts that you publish in journals. If you're in industry, your output are products, and the measurement of the success of that product is how much money you make from that product. Very divergent, although complementary in terms of making vaccines, actual goals. And what the key message here is, don't expect universities to make vaccines. That's not their output, and they may want to get the IP for it and move it on, but somebody else has to develop it, and that somebody else has to have the skills for actually development versus research. So here, again, is this the scientific discovery in university, some sort of industry or something like making development, where actually then you actually drive it. And it's the lack of social value that really kills this one here in the middle in terms of taking university discoveries and moving them onwards. Why do I say that? Because I think there's low social value given to vaccines by both industry that follows social value and profits and therefore is not very interested in making vaccines. We used to have a dozen pharmaceutical industry developing vaccines in this country, and we're down now to just a couple. And unfortunately, they're not valued by society, really the pull factor here to making a market for it, because we're very reticent about using vaccines, and it takes that long for us to take a vaccine and actually deliver it to the people. Now, why is that important? Industry thinks of the profits they make per year per investment. And if they're going to put a big investment, and I'll get into that, into a product, they want the return on that investment fast. And you say these ugly industrial people, guys, I guarantee you that you and your family have money in these industries in some sort of a portfolio that someone has that is gaining money for your future investment in pharmaceutical industry. And their goal is to increase the value of that portfolio. Their responsibility is to increase the value of that portfolio and make good drugs. It is not to save the world from vaccines, so don't blame the pharmaceutical industry. Their goal is to make your portfolio better and indeed, hopefully, make the health better, but following social value of what we will pay for. And my conclusion here is that it's better not to make vaccines if you're in the pharmaceutical industry, as I'll get into in a second. So the public health role here is very interesting. As a public health doctor, I consider myself a public health doctor, and as a career person with CDC in Atlanta, I was giving value to vaccines. I think they're wonderful things, and we've got to go out there and deliver them. So we recognize the value of vaccines, but we're always talking about how they have to cost a nickel, almost always. The pharmaceutical industry is ugly. They try to charge $2, $3, or $5 for these things, and so they're ugly, so let's just grind it down to a couple of dollars. And then there's very little political value to say that either through taxation or through the other society paying for these things, that they should come through with the money necessary to deliver it. Now look at this. This is a very interesting graph from Marie-Therese in WHO that looks at vaccines from different parts of the world. This is divided in the industrialized countries here and developing countries here. And this is the population. This is the disease burden that follows the population, that most of the disease burden is in the developing world. And now let's look at the vaccine market. That the vaccine market is 82% of the $6 billion vaccine market is in the industrialized world. And that 90% of the investment in vaccine development comes from the industrialized world to make money on this 82% of the market that really only accounts for about 10, 15% of the disease. There's a real imbalance here that you have all the disease in the developing world and all the profit on this side of the ocean, and therefore vaccines will be developed, if at all, for here. This just looks at the cost of the vaccines. When I said we'd try to drive the cost down, look at what is paid, for example, here with measles vaccine in the low-income countries, 14 cents per dose. It costs you $1 to put it in a bottle. So the industry is losing money because it gets grinding down and grinding down the price of these things so that WHO and UNICEF, your holiday cards, can buy it. And even in the high-income countries, you're only spending $15 per dose. Now, think out what next time you go to McDonald's, you'll spend $15, but people will complain that $15 is too much for a vaccine that will prevent all these diseases. So this is a WHO statement. Let me just summarize it, that the low and uncertain demand for vaccines and the lack of return on these vaccines and the continued hammering of industry to get the vaccine down drives industry out of the vaccine business. And I want you all in the next few minutes to put yourself on the board of directors of a company that has to make a decision if you're going to invest in the research for a vaccine versus you're going to invest in another drug to increase erections. And hold on a second, my telephone is going to ring and I'm going to shut it off. Now let me just deal with you're sitting on this board and you are being asked to invest in this stuff and see how much it costs actually of your money from your company. This is just one example of the flu vaccine recently licensed a couple of years ago in the United States, where there is public information on it, that the R&D for the vaccine cost $145 million, and then the manufacturing $200 million, so a total of $345 million to take one vaccine from the bench and the discovery of academic research to actually making the vaccine through the development process and available to the market. So that it costs, to bring a vaccine to market, everyone will agree, costs somewhere between $200 and $500 million and 12 to 15 years from the time that you bring it into a company and then you get it out. To be honest, this is what it costs to develop a drug, a vaccine or any other drug in the pharmaceutical industry. It's a very expensive process with lots of work. You start with your initial discovery, and then you get into animals, and then you get into humans and phase 3 trials, and you got thousands of people, and it costs this kind of money in order to do it. That's just a fact of life. So if you're going to make a vaccine, let's say that this side of the room comes to the board of directors of the company. You guys are the top of the board of directors, and you guys are the scientists. And they come to you and they say, we would like to make a vaccine for the disease X, and this is our plan for it, and this is how much money it's going to cost. Now, this side of the group comes to the board of directors and says, we have a drug for erections or whatever you want, that we have our development plan, and we want to develop this because we think this is an important drug that we like to develop, and you guys at the top are going to have to make the decision. Well, look at here. This is the total revenue in billions of dollars per year for a few drugs that I just chose. This is all vaccines, all, 10 vaccines that we market in the United States. Sits up there about $6 billion. This is the market for the less developed countries, which doesn't make $1 billion. These are two drugs, one to lower cholesterol and the other to decrease heartburn. Some of you in this room probably take these drugs. Good drugs, important drugs. But this side of the room wants to develop another one of these, and this side wants to develop a vaccine. You guys in the board of directors have really only one choice. You look at the potential this is divided into a dozen different lines, so nothing comes above $2 billion here. You make a choice. I'd rather have you guys develop your erection drug or something, and you guys lose and you guys win. And that's not an ethical issue. It's not a scientific issue. It is just one of social value. We pay money for these drugs, and we don't pay money for the vaccines that make it a significant market. So this lack of social value ends up really being very expensive. You end up without the social value and lack of political leadership. They interact, so you end up having continued disease occurrence in the long run. And these are the costs. Continued disease occurrence, which is terrible, as I showed you on polio, and these huge delays. And equally important in a public health sense, the increased infected pool. That the longer you delay the control of a disease, the more people get infected, they're the more source of infection for others, and you end up having more disease, more difficult to control in the future. So it compounds itself with time. And then lastly, you end up with a very limited market for vaccines, little social demand for it, and therefore less industry incentive to make vaccines, which causes more delay in the vaccines, and the whole thing perpetuates itself for the future. That's the end of the downer part of the talk. It is indeed a very discouraging, after someone like myself who's actually been out there eradicating diseases and see the potential we have in biotechnology to make vaccines, it's a shame that we're not better to adjust those social values so that they become some sort of more equal, especially for the less developed parts of the world. And generally this is divided into two parts. Push, that is, you push the development of a product through an industry, and pull, that you pull the product through industrial development by increasing the price and increasing the purchase. And both of these have been recently in play for the last almost a decade now, especially as a result of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. But there's quite a few. If you go back in history, interestingly, as I mentioned before, at the bottom of this slide, you see that the March of Dimes is the one that really drove the development of the polio vaccine, with Jonas Salk and Albert Sabin being the ones who developed the vaccine. But before that, the Rockefeller Foundation developed the yellow fever vaccine, and before that, Institut Pasteur in Paris had developed all of the several of the vaccines that we use still today in childhood vaccines. But now it is really adjusting again, and it's very nice to see, especially for the less developed parts of the world. You see all of these various vaccine development, public-private partnerships, very much like the Rockefeller and the March of Dimes, where we have vaccines for tuberculosis, malaria. This is us in working on HIV and others. Hookworm Vaccine Initiative that you heard from here, the International AIDS Vaccine Initiative in New York, the Malaria Vaccine Initiative, dengue, pneumococcal, rotavirus, and South African AIDS Vaccine Initiative. Most of it funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, but also from other sources. And then we have what we've really seen, also, I think, stimulated primarily by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, setting up the Global Fund and like in the European Union, donating huge amounts of money to actually pull vaccines in, especially for the less developed parts of the world. That is setting up a market where they put literally now billions of dollars into the purchase and delivery of vaccines in the less developed parts of the world. So there is a market if somebody wants to develop it, either the not-for-profit institutions I showed you on the previous slide or for-profit sector, that there is more of a market for these vaccines. So in summary, I think that vaccine development is expensive. With $200 to $500 million. It's slow. It takes really a decade or more. The skills necessary to develop vaccines rest primarily with the private sector. Hopefully that's getting more into the not-for-profit now. And the same cost and effort, pharmaceutical companies can develop therapeutic products that have far more profit than a vaccine. Public health leaders are cheap and unwilling to pay reasonable prices for valuable vaccines. I say that as someone who did that. And indeed espoused that. The lack of social value given to vaccines makes them unattractive products for the pharmaceutical industry to develop, and vaccines, once developed, are often applied slowly, and so the return on the investment is even compounded. But there are positive changes. The public-private vaccine development partnerships having pharmaceutical development expertise are being established. That was the list I showed you. Funding is being provided, most notably by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and foundation support is driving public health authorities to deliver existing vaccines through the pull process. So in summary, I think we have gone through an evolution here where in the past we relied on foundations and social efforts to make vaccines, recognizing there were terrible diseases out there and we had some skills to make them. And then we really let the private sector do this without recognizing the private sector didn't have much enthusiasm as time has gone on. And the tremendous biotechnological revolution that has occurred is being directed towards very profitable products for cancer and other diseases that are very important. However, it leaves a huge void in the vaccine, especially for the third world. And I think we're seeing some positive movement, especially stimulated out of Seattle with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, to actually try to readjust that both from the development of vaccines and the actual purchase of vaccines for the third world. With that, I will stop and we can deal with some questions. Thank you.